Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan and welcome to Words in Time. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about 5 books that I found to be rather difficult reads. But when I say difficult, I don't necessarily think that that is a good or a bad thing. Some of these books I kind of struggled with and never really connected to them. But some of them I pushed through and in the end I found them to be really rewarding. So let's get started with Neuromancer by William Gibson. Henry Dorset Case was the sharpest data thief in the business, until vengeful former employees crippled his nervous system. But now a new and mysterious employer recruits him for a last chance run. The target? An unthinkably powerful artificial intelligence orbiting Earth in service of a sinister business clan. So the first thing that makes Neuromancer a little bit of a tricky read is that there's quite a lot of terminology. And William Gibson never holds your hand in this regard. So when he references a doohickey what's it now, there's never a character to say, oh, and by the way, this is what a doohickey what's it now actually does. And the terminology in Neuromancer is actually kind of cool. The book actually helped popularize terms like the Matrix and cyberspace, but for terms that aren't already in the public lexicon that you aren't already familiar with, you will have to try and pick them up through context or just figuring them out as you go through the book. So something else that makes William Gibson's writing style interesting is that a lot of writers will spend time setting up a scene, describing a scene, and then explaining the meaning of the results of that scene. Whereas Gibson will just describe the scene, and that's not always that easy to follow because of the terminology that I mentioned, and by skipping a lot of the setup and explanation, a lot of the anticipation and interpretation then comes down to the reader. And I'm sure a lot of people will really enjoy that, but it does mean it is a little bit of a less fast-paced read. The reader does have to do a bit more work themselves. So overall, this is a book where I didn't necessarily love the actual reading experience, but it is one that I've come to respect and appreciate more over time, the more reading up on it, the more research that I've done on the book since having finished it. I don't do a lot of rereads, but if I created a list of books that I do want to do a reread for, Neuromancer would definitely be on it. Up next, we have Dragon's Egg by Robert L. Forward. On a neutron star with a surface gravity 67 billion times that of Earth, a plant-like organism evolves into an intelligent species known as the Chela. While this species is evolving, human astronomers detect this neutron star and set out on an expedition to explore it. So of the books on this list, I would say that this is one where the story is rather easy to follow. In fact, the blurb probably tells you about 75% of what happens, because the point of this book is less about what happens and more about how it happens. It does have a little bit of a similar premise to Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, but instead of Children of Time, which has maybe 20% science, 80% story, this book has about 20% story and 80% science. The book dives quite heavily into the physics of the neutron star and the biology of the Chela. If you want to get a bit of a sense of how much thought Robert L. Forward put into the physics of this book, seeing as he was an actual physicist, I already thought the book was quite heavy on the science, and the book is then followed with a 24-page technical appendix full of graphs and formulae and all that good sciencey stuff. I actually quite enjoyed the appendix, if only because it was rather amusing that it pointed out how far off I actually was when it came to picturing and understanding a lot of what was happening in the book. Apparently, my high school physics class did not quite put me on the same level as Robert L. Forward. So overall, this is a book that I did enjoy, in particular the ending. I think if you're someone that loves hard sci-fi, or perhaps you have a physics background, then this could be something that would really hit for you. But if you're someone that likes a bit of science, but perhaps wants to balance that out with a few more human elements, then something with a similar premise that might land for you a little bit harder would be Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Third on the list, we have Use of Weapons by Ian M. Banks. Cheridanine Zakawe was born outside the culture, but was recruited into it by Special Circumstances Agent Diziet Smar to work as an operative intervening in less advanced civilizations. The novel recounts several of these interventions and Zakawe's attempts to come to terms with his own past. So probably the most unique aspect of Use of Weapons is its structure. It follows 2 timelines, one that moves forward in time and the other that moves backwards in time. And I like things that play with time, play with structure, such as Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell or the film Memento by Christopher Nolan. But what makes Use of Weapons particularly tricky is that we also have a prologue and an epilogue that occur at a different time, and then also within the chapters of the storylines that are moving forwards and backwards, we also get flashbacks. So piecing together the exact timeline in this book isn't necessarily the simplest of tasks. Something else that I found while reading the book was that, for me, the sentences made sense, but the pages didn't. And what I mean by that is that I was literally able to follow what was happening, but I was struggling to find the purpose of individual chapters. And I think that's because a lot of the chapters didn't necessarily have their own individual purpose or objective. Often when you're reading a chapter such as planning to rob a bank, we get together, we formulate a plan, and at the end of the chapter, we now know what to expect when we attempt to rob the bank. But in Use of Weapons by Ian M. Banks, each of the chapters aren't necessarily setting something up within the chapter or the next chapter or even the previous chapter. Often these things the purpose of them are only revealed by the time you get to the end of the book. And that makes the end of the book quite rewarding, but as a reader, I was struggling to find a little bit of direction or momentum in order to pull me through to that ending. So overall, this is a book that I somewhat enjoyed, but I think it's a book that uses a particular structure in order to set up a particular payoff at the end. And unfortunately for me, just before Use of Weapons, I had read a book that uses a kind of similar concept, and so the impact of that ending was just slightly lessened for me. But that's just unfortunate timing. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that were really impacted by the ending of Use of Weapons. With our second last book on the list, we have The Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe. The Shadow of the Torturer is the tale of young Severian, an apprentice in the Guild of Torturers on the world called Earth, spelled U-R-T-H, exiled for committing the ultimate sin of his profession, showing mercy towards his victim. And it follows his subsequent journey out of his home city of Nessus. So this is a book that I think, on a surface level, isn't too hard to follow. But a lot of the words used either don't have much meaning or they don't mean what you think they mean. Also, a lot of things don't make sense until you do a deep dive on the literary and historical references, or you get to the later books, or I should say later parts of the single book that is the Book of the New Sun. Now, I've actually only read The Shadow of the Torturer. I haven't completed the Book of the New Sun, but that's not because of the difficulty of the reading experience. I was actually quite intrigued by the world building. It was more just that I didn't enjoy being in the mind of Severian. It's a first-person story, and I really just didn't enjoy that particular character's perspective. But even though it didn't work for me, I can see the appeal of the series. When I'm on Discord in Sci-Fi book servers, whenever I see that there's 100 plus new messages, more often than not than any other book or series is because some Book of the New Sun enthusiasts are going into a deep dive on theories and explanations, and it's really cool to see a series that people love spending so much time exploring and reading about. Speaking of Discord, if you'd like to discuss sci-fi books with us, then feel free to join my Discord server. I'll leave the link to that in the description below, and if you're interested in some of the perks of becoming a patron, such as joining video hangouts or voting on my TBR, then check out how you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima. And finally, we have Permutation City by Greg Egan. Permutation City is the story of a man with a vision. Immortality, for those who can afford it, is found in cyberspace. Encompassing the lives and struggles of an artificial life junkie, desperate to save her dying mother, a billionaire banker scarred by a terrible crime, and lovers for whom, in their virtual world, love is not enough. So Permutation City is another book that goes rather hard on the science, in particular biochemistry, mathematics, and quantum physics. In the book, there is a decent amount of technical descriptions, some of which I was able to semi-grasp, and other bits that went over my head. And something else that Permutation City does is that it changes the fundamental assumptions of the universe. So parts of this story take place in a universe which in some ways seem familiar, but in other ways are quite different because the actual building blocks of the universe have been changed. So that I found to be a really interesting idea to explore, but also something that was quite tricky to imagine and wrap your mind around. But I have to say we're ending on a high note here, because even though there were some somewhat tricky concepts and I did have to Google some things after having finished the book, I absolutely love it. The ideas in this book just absolutely blew me away, and Permutation City became an instant favorite. So there you go, guys. Those are 5 difficult sci-fi books that I've read. Let me know your thoughts on them if you've read any of these 5 books, and let me know if there are any other sci-fi books that you've read that you found difficult but rewarding that you think I should read. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe, and you can find more sci-fi content over here.